good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with you today. I should say, actually, again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And it's actually 11 p.m. in Perth, Australia, where our speaker today is located. So we are covering almost all time zones, probably. Let's see if we'll get more people in here, and then we will get going in a minute. All right.
I'm in England this week, if that makes a change. Someone.
Well, that's great. And what, it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon for you?
That's exactly right. It is, yes. Time for a cup of tea.
Well, great. Yeah.
Good morning, Gene.
Good morning. It's nice to see you.
I'm in Cincinnati this morning.
Okay, so it's about 11 o'clock in the morning for you, probably, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes, okay. Well, great. Let's get going. Most everybody is in now. We've got a big group this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. Today is June 17th, 2021. And our special guest today is Dr. Samantha Hardy. As you know, these Will Work for Food programs were started last spring by Natalie Armstrong-Motin, whose brainchild this was, in order to raise money for food banks around the world. The audience has grown exponentially, and this community is fantastic through reaching all corners of the world and helping feed people all over the world. So how are we then today, Jeff? Do you want to tell us about where we stand with donations? Jeff?
Oh, it looks like maybe Jeff got stuck. So before we ask, well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before we ask Jeff to give us the number of Will Work for Food donations, I just wanted to say thank you to you personally, Jeff. I know that on your LinkedIn, you invited all of us to help you celebrate your birthday. Big 65, happy birthday to you, sir.
Thank you, thank you.
And your invitation included also an invitation to donate to a food bank rather than send cards or that kind of thing. And so we appreciate that you continued the Will Work for Food goals even for your personal day.
You're very welcome, Natalie. It's a worthy cause, such a worthy cause, and I'm delighted to be part of it along with you and Jean and everybody in our audience. It's one of my favorite parts of the webinar every week when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks in recognition of our great speakers. So far, the total is $117,520. And we know that Samantha Hardy is going to give a great presentation today. Let's top that $120,000 mark this week. Thanks, everybody.
Well, that's fantastic, Jeff, and that's fantastic, everyone. So thank you so much. And thank you in particular to Jeff and Natalie for getting this going and for building it. And it's just an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all today. So moving to Dr. Hardy, Dr. Samantha Hardy provides coaching and conflict support and training to managers and leaders across the world. She's based in Australia and has been accredited as a mediator under the Australian National Mediation Accreditation System and is a certified transformative mediator by the U.S. Institute of Conflict Transformation. She's also a certified narrative coach, an experienced conflict coach, and the founder of the Real Conflict Coaching System. She has a PhD in law and conflict resolution, as well as other postgraduate qualifications in adult education. She is committed to lifelong learning and continued development. Dr. Hardy is a well-known trainer and university educator, holding adjunct appointments at a number of universities in Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the US. She has also published widely in conflict resolution, including several books, Dispute Resolution in Australia, Mediation for Lawyers, and her new book, which is just coming out, Conflict Coaching Fundamentals. She received the 2021 Resolution Institute Award for services to dispute resolution in Australia for her leadership and innovation in dispute resolution. And her company's website is cciacademy.com. And there's, in their vision statement, there's a statement there that really struck me, and I thought I would read part of this to you as part of her introduction, and then we will get into it here. But imagine a world in which people think of conflict as a good thing, where conflict is an opportunity to learn from one another, to grow and to build connections. A world in which people can disagree with candor and respect. A world in which everyone encourages and supports disagreement and difference. Imagine a world in which conflict is not a dirty word. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Rather, peace is what happens when we learn to manage conflict in a constructive way. And on those words, I will turn it over to Dr. Hardy. Thank you so much. And tell us about your food bank too, please. Yes.
I will. Thank you. Just so that everyone can see, I have some slides that are embedded in my video. So the best way to view it on Zoom is to change it to speaker view. If you have it on gallery view, you won't have a chance of reading. The text will be way too small. But if you put it on speaker view so that my screen fills your screen, you should be able to read it. The slides are not super important. If you want a copy of them later on, you can contact me and I'm happy to send them to you. But if you do want to follow along, if you're a visual kind of learner and you like to see some words as well as hear them, that would be the best way to do it. So my food bank is Food Bank Australia. It's the national food bank that's actually based here in Perth, so it has a local connection to me. I'm on the west coast of Australia. That's the website. They have a click to donate button on there, and it would be a really great thing to contribute to the ever-growing amount that has been raised for food banks across the world, and I'm really glad to be contributing to that today. I warned Jean when I spoke with her yesterday, I think, or the day before, that I can talk a lot for a very long time, and I'm going to do my best to keep within the time. But it also does mean that I'm probably going to speak very quickly to try and get through some of the things that I want to get through today. Now, somebody asked a question on LinkedIn, which was a really great question, and it hadn't occurred to me that I needed to explain it a little bit more. But somebody said, what is a conflict story? And I guess just to start us off, for me, a conflict story is a story that we tell ourselves about our conflict. And everyone's conflict story is different, but in some ways we all have very similar themes. Actually, what I looked at in my PhD research, and it's the topic of the book that's coming out in September, published by Routledge, is that there are two main types of conflict stories. There's one that tends to entrap us, tends to turn us into a helpless victim and makes us less able to manage our conflict constructively. And there is a different kind of conflict story, which is one of learning, growth, and resilience. And that is one that some people come to naturally and some people need a little bit of help to get there. And so conflict coaching for me is a process that helps people explore and hopefully escape from those dysfunctional conflict stories that entrap us and make us helpless, and help us develop a more constructive way of thinking about and then experiencing our conflict. And you'd be surprised how much working with one person in the conflict can make a significant difference. One person is part of the bigger system, and a little change in the system can have ripple effects. So that's kind of the basic premise of what I'm going to talk about today. I can see kind of a Brady Bunch type panel of people, but I think there's about 5 or 6 screens of people now. But I wondered how many people are familiar with conflict coaching. Can you maybe wave at the camera and give me a bit of an indication if you're familiar with it? Oh, I can see a few hands. That's great. Great. Excellent. All right, so for you, some of what I'm going to say is really basic, but I'll hopefully add some value or a different sort of slant on what you already know. So here's my definition. So conflict coaching is often called conflict management coaching, to kind of reinforce the fact that we're not sort of boxing coaches. We're not teaching people to have bad kind of conflict. We're often teaching them to manage it and hopefully resolve it in a constructive way. So it's a one-on-one process. It can be used with a person who is currently in conflict, or it can be used with someone who manages people in conflict. So a lot of my work is working with leaders who get put into a leadership position because they're very good in their industry. They might be great engineers or great lawyers, but they're not necessarily trained at managing staff conflict. And so a lot of what I do is coach people to develop their capacity to manage others in conflict, as well as coach people who are in conflict and would like to do better. And most people in conflict would like to do better. What a coach does, and this is my definition, is to help people reflect. So it's very much a process of reflection. And I know you've had Michael Lang speaking about reflection. Reflect on their conflict experiences and learn from them. So part of what I do is I help people think differently about those experiences, to explore them in different ways, to unpack the story they're telling themselves about how they got into this mess and what possibilities or lack of possibilities there are to get out of it. So I help them also gain some new perspectives, and we do that very pragmatically. You know, what would the other person say if I asked them to describe what was happening? What's somebody who might be observing it or being impacted by it? How might they describe? What story would they tell? And an independent perspective. So it's the same kind of stuff that you probably heard of before with the different perspectives, but we do it in a very story-based way. We help people explore the relationship between the conflict and their emotions. And that might be emotions causing conflict. It might be emotions as a result of conflict. It might be emotions that are making it challenging for them to manage the conflict or have a conversation to resolve the conflict. But we also help them explore how other people's emotions are having some sort of impact on the conflict situation, sometimes positively, often it's a negative relationship. We help them identify and hopefully avoid dysfunctional thinking and behaviour in conflict. And most importantly, we help them make informed choices in the future. And so you can see, if you work in a mediation setting, conflict coaching works really well as a pre-mediation process, because it gets people in a mindset where they're ready to participate. And then, you know, in a pre-mediation context as a mediator, you prepare people for the mediation, but it's often a very pragmatic type of preparation. You know, think about your underlying interests, think about questions you might want to ask. Are there things that you need the other person to know? What can you let go of here? You know, where's the room for compromise? What I do is a step before that. It's getting people in the mindset to be ready to do those things. So one of the things that often happens in mediation is reality testing. We reality test somebody's idea of what might be possible or their expectations. What I say is, if people are stuck in this negative conflict story, you can't reality test them, because their story of what their reality is so far different from ours as the mediator that reality testing doesn't work for them. It doesn't make any sense to them because we're in a different reality. So in a way, what I help them do is explore a different reality than the story they're telling themselves, so that when they are reality tested, it has some context for them. It connects with them a little more. So in my model, which is the real conflict coaching model, I say what I do is I help people develop the 5 C's. The first one is clarity. I help them gain clarity about their conflict. And you all know, when people are in conflict, particularly that messy kind of I feel stuck conflict, often a very common experience is they feel confused. They're not really sure what's going on and how can this be possible and what's true and what's not true and how can they be thinking that, and I don't even know how I got into this mess. So a lot of what I do is get people to slow down, go back over the story, look at the detail, really look at some specifics, pay attention to things that they might have skimmed over in the story that they're repeating to themselves. And as we repeat our conflict stories over and over again, they become more simple. They become more coherent, but they also become narrower and limit at what we see as what might be possible. So I help them identify their facts, their assumptions, if there's missing information, and hopefully they become a bit clearer. Now, then they're not going to have a perfect understanding, because there are other perspectives, other people have information that they don't have, but with whatever they have access to, I help them pay attention to things in a little bit different ways. So that they are clearer at the end of the process. as part of that, they also increase the second C, comprehension, their understanding. And often that's about understanding their own needs, understanding other people's needs, and understanding the impact of the situation on themselves and on other people. And again, you can kind of do this work in mediation, but it's not always easy. And often in mediation, you have a limited time, you have somebody else present. If you're doing joint sessions, there's pressure to sort of achieve something. Conflict coaching is a bit of a slower, we don't have to achieve anything. We're just going to think differently. We're just going to explore the nooks and crannies. We're going to look underneath the rocks that you might have jumped across in the path to where you are now. We're going to really slow down and have a look around. One of my students said the other day, Sam says, it's not about which path do you go down. It's before you even choose a path, let's look at the scenery. Let's have a look around. Let's look, there's a bird over there and there's a rock there. And maybe we can actually make a new path that wasn't even one of the ones that we were choosing between. And I really like that analogy. This third point is the third C, choices. We want to help the client identify and evaluate their choices, past choices as well as present choices. And why the past choices are important is because people who are stuck in this negative conflict story often feel like they haven't had any choice. They've been the helpless victim of somebody else's actions. They've been sort of just this passive sort of tumbleweed in the other person's sort of tornado. But the reality is, in almost all cases, they have made some choices along the way. They've made some choices that might have contributed to the conflict, that might have escalated the conflict, that might have stopped the conflict getting as bad as it did. You know, there were probably choices they made along the way that were also positive choices. In some instances, in some interactions, they probably made a good choice. And that's something that I would help them identify so we can build on that kind of confidence that, you know, sometimes you make mistakes, but other times you've made wise choices. Let's unpack what made that one a wise choice and that one maybe one in hindsight that you do differently. And what that does is builds people's mindset to be able to see future choices. So it opens up the opportunity for option generation, if we use the kind of standard mediation term. We also did two other things, and these are the last two C's. We developed people's competence and confidence. And by competence, I mean skills to manage conflict. And I don't mean I train them. I don't say to them, oh, you know, if you use an I statement, that can be less confrontational. Or, do you know, I don't say, do you understand the difference between positions and interests? Let me explain that to you and maybe that will help you. Rather, what I do is I give them opportunities to practice and learn from their own attempts. So an example I give is I remember this vividly, being at high school, doing one of those, I don't even know the name of it, whether it was algebra or calculus, but one of those mathematics activities that have lots of different steps. And if you make a little mistake in one step, it makes your answer wrong. And you've got to go back through every single step and try and figure out where you've made the mistake. And I had this mindset that I was bad at maths, and it infuriated me when I got the answer wrong. And I remember saying to my mother, I can't do this. I can't do it. I don't know how to do it. I'm really bad at maths. I just wish I didn't have to do this subject. And my mother said to me, well, tell me what are you trying to do? Like, what is it? And I'm like, oh, you know, this and this and this. And she's like, well, what did they tell you? What were the steps? Talk me through the steps. Okay, and show me what you did then. Which step did you do? And what was the next step? And as she made me explain to her what I was trying to do and what I had done, I noticed where I'd made the mistake. And I said, oh, it's there, Mum. Look, that's it. That's the bit where I made the mistake. And she said, well, fix it and see what happens. And what she did, she didn't tell me, oh, the third step, that's where you made the mistake, fix it up and then it will make sense. She supported me to figure it out for myself. And in doing so, it built confidence. Next time when I got the answer wrong, rather than immediately calling my mother, I thought, I can do this. I go through again. I think, what was I meant to be doing? What did I do? And I figured it out for myself. So in a way, what I do with clients in conflict is the same thing. I say, well, what would you have liked to have said if there were no consequences? You know, hit me with the absolute most rude thing that you would have liked to have said. And then I say, okay, would you have said that if you went back now? Is that what you'd say? Well, no, I wouldn't say that. It's completely rude and inappropriate. Okay, great. So what you said was a better choice than that one. But what are some other ways you could have said it? And I give them an opportunity to practice. And what that does is it builds their skills based on their own attempts and reattempts and revisions. But it also does the last one. It builds their confidence because they recognize that they do in themselves have kind of a toolkit and the ability to come up with different ideas and ways of doing things that will build their capacity into the future. They're not always going to need me to help them figure out what to do. They can build confidence that they have the internal kind of skills and knowledge and understanding of their own situation, their own communication styles, to be able to do it, to figure it out without being taught. And that's not to say people don't sometimes need some extra help, but it's amazing what people can do with a minimal supportive type intervention like conflict coaching. So it can be used in a number of different ways before conflict arises. So a lot of the work that I do with leaders is, for example, a big change is coming. There's a merger or some significant change, a restructuring, and they know there's conflict coming up. So we do it as a kind of preventative exercise. Let's imagine the sorts of things that could happen. Let's imagine the different ways that you might respond, what sort of things, what are the pros and cons of this and that and the other. So we do some sort of future planning. It most often happens in conflict. So someone's in the middle of conflict and they want some help to talk it through in a safe environment, confidential environment, where I'm not giving them advice, but I'm just helping them think differently about it so that they can come up with some new ideas. It can be used alongside a process like mediation or another process. It can sometimes be used instead of. So often in workplace contexts, people now are saying, oh, I don't want to go to mediation, that's too formal, which is kind of ironic given it was meant to be the informal version. They say, oh, I don't want to go to mediation, it's too formal. They have to sign an agreement and it'll be on my file. Can I just go to conflict coaching? Because then I only have to talk to the coach, not actually talk to the other person. So sometimes people choose it for the wrong reasons. But what often happens is as I work with them, they realize I can actually talk to that other person without the need for a mediator, or there are things I can do to improve this without having to go to mediation, without having to make a formal grievance. So sometimes it can make significant difference without another process. This second last one is a really interesting use of it. It can be used after a process, so after an agreement's reached in mediation or after the outcome of, say, a workplace investigation, where, yes, there's an agreement, but the reality of implementing that agreement is not always easy. You know, in a workplace investigation, if the claim hasn't been substantiated and the parties are told go back and work with each other and kind of pretend it didn't happen because it was unfounded, it's not that easy. Or in a family dispute where parents reach a parenting agreement, but then the reality of life means that it doesn't really go smoothly. Coaching can be a sort of an individual check-in saying, how's it going? You know, what's working, what's not working? What are some things you can do to make it work or to adapt it without the whole thing falling apart or having to go back to court or to mediation? And I already mentioned we use it as a sort of professional development leadership activity. It's used, I would say in Australia at least, primarily in the workplace. It's being used quite a lot now in family conflict, particularly in parenting conflict. It's being incorporated as part of some of the restorative work that's being done in schools. So I worked on a really great project with my friend and colleague Nadia Alexander in Hong Kong, and we trained a whole lot of school teachers and young Rotaract members. It was basically the real conflict coaching system, but we called it peace coaching. And what happened was each of the Rotary clubs sponsored a school in Hong Kong. And they had the young Rotaractors attached. And so every Friday, one of the young Rotaractors would go to the school during lunch hour and set up a peace coaching booth. It was often just a room or a place in the school. And the kids, this is in high school, so kids sort of 12 to 18, who had a conflict. It could be with a teacher, with a peer, with someone at home, and they wanted to talk to someone who wasn't an authority figure, who was separate from the people that were involved, could go along to the peace coach and be talked through this coaching process, which was aimed at giving them the opportunity to come up with some different ideas with fairly minimal guidance. And anyone who has teenagers know that they don't like being told what to do. but they respond quite well to this kind of coaching process where you're helping them figure it out for themselves. It's starting to be used in business negotiations and community conflict situations, and it's now starting to be adopted by international NGOs to support people managing international conflict. So that's a really interesting one. And I guess my research that sort of led to this was really based on individual conflict, but it's interesting how it's being adapted to group work now. I think it's amazing. So who provides it? There is a sort of I wouldn't go so far as to call it a profession, but there are people who are independent conflict coaches, who are consultants. They're often people who are mediators as well. So it's kind of an extra service to add if you're a mediator. And it gives you an opportunity to do one-on-one work where, for example, one party doesn't want to participate in mediation, or, you know, the parties might need a little bit of help to be ready for mediation, or post-mediation, as I said, to help people kind of manage the outcome. In some organisations, they have panels of in-house coaches. So I recently trained a big government agency here, about 30 of their HR staff, and they have hundreds of HR staff, but I trained about 30 of them in the coaching model. And what they now do is they're part of an internal dispute resolution system. And so if someone has a conflict that they don't want to make a formal grievance about, and they don't necessarily think they need mediation, or they're not comfortable with mediation, they can contact the agency's dispute resolution manager and say, can you allocate me a coach? They're allocated with someone on the panel who's in a different region, and that person supports them to come up with their own ideas for managing the conflict. Often as a triage process into another process, but sometimes, and more often than you'd expect, it actually gives that person enough confidence and competence to manage the matter in a constructive way themselves. And I think that's another thing that's really important. Conflict coaching is not just about helping people resolve conflict. That's often an outcome of it. It's more about building people's capacity to manage conflict better. In the particular conflict, yes, but also in the future. So it's aiming at giving them capacity to do this themselves later on in other contexts, in other situations. Managers are using it. So I do a lot of work training managers to use this with their subordinates, with their employees or their teams. It's not instead of traditional kind of management where you might have to give feedback and direction, but it can often be a first step. And it's also very useful to build employees' capacity to manage their own conflict. Human resources professionals, it works very well with teenage children, not so much younger children, but teenage children, it can work quite well. And I gave you the example of in schools, teachers or child counsellors. Sometimes the school nurse has adopted this kind of role in an informal sense. I'm not going to go through this because I'm already talking really quickly and I'm conscious of time. Conflict coaching has overlaps, but is different with some of these things. So just to give you a couple of dot points, generally speaking, a conflict coach does not give advice. It's very much a facilitated, reflective process where the client is the expert and figures out what's going on for themselves. And it's probably particularly important in coaching where you may only be hearing one side of the story. So you have to be very careful because you don't know what's going on. You've just heard one person's perspective. So you treat it as this person's reality, but not necessarily the reality. So it's very, very risky to give advice in this setting. We don't advocate, we don't go and talk to the other person on behalf of the client. Generally speaking, I recommend not being a coach for both parties to the conflict, because part of the power of the role is being on that person's team, in a sense, not on their team against the other person, but on their team in the sense that that individual is your primary interest. And it promotes openness because the client isn't worried. If you ask a question, they're not thinking, I wonder why she's asking that. Is something the other person said? I wonder, oh, maybe they're worried about, there's a whole lot of second guessing when you're dealing with both parties. So that's one difference from mediation. And you don't have to worry so much about impartiality. You don't have to worry about doing things like reframing, because the other person's not listening, they're not present. It does overlap with counselling in some ways, but I would say a counsellor would do more than what I would be comfortable doing with a client. So I would not be, if a client was really struggling with emotions, beyond what is kind of within the realms of kind of normal emotional responses to conflict, I would probably be referring them to a counsellor, maybe before coming back to coaching or alongside coaching or sometimes instead of coaching. But I think a good counsellor could do a lot of what I do. But there are boundaries where I'd be thinking, oh, my competence, I'm a bit beyond my comfort zone here. But there are some overlaps. Training, in some ways, there's some overlap in the sense that the client often learns from the coaching, but I guess the difference is they're learning from themselves, they're learning from their own experiences. I'm prompting that sometimes by asking questions, but I'm not saying to them, oh, this is what you should do, or this is a suggestion on how to say it. I'm just encouraging them to come up with different ideas. Now, you know, it's a sliding scale. How you ask a question can be giving advice or training them in a subtle way, but I try to keep it at the non-training end of the scale. Mentoring is similar, but mentoring is often the mentor giving advice based on their own experience. My experience isn't relevant in conflict coaching, although my expertise in conflict dynamics and the way that people experience conflict does inform the questions that I ask. So again, it's a little bit of a, it wouldn't be entirely true if I said my expertise didn't matter, but I don't use it in the sense of sharing it with the client explicitly. It's more that it guides my questioning of the client. And that's the other thing, I guess, to contrast with mediation. I do very little summarizing, paraphrasing, reframing in coaching. Primarily what I do is listen and ask questions, almost always open-ended questions. Occasionally I might challenge them, but it'll be in the sense that I'll say, I noticed that you've said A and you also said B. And as I'm listening, I don't understand how those things are connected, or those two things don't seem to sit well in my understanding. Can you tell me more about that? So I'll make an observation rather than saying, well, those two things they don't make sense. You can't say A and B at the same time. So again, it's a bit of semantics. And supervision, a supervisor in an employment sense could use coaching as a way of supervising, but I guess the difference is in supervising, you're in a power relationship and you do have the ability to direct them. Whereas as a coach, and particularly as an independent external person, I don't have any control over what happens. It's totally up to the client, what they do after the session. I think I talked about this before, but I'll just quickly go through this because I know a lot of you come from a mediation background. How coaching supports mediation. Less work has to be done in the mediation. If you're a mediator and you get 2 clients who have been through coaching, they will be your dream clients. Well, no, I can't guarantee that, let's be honest, but they are much more likely to hit the ground running. You know, they will be more prepared to have an open mind, and it's more maybe about the mindset than them coming in with a whole lot of different proposed offers and a list of actual interests and, you know, those sorts of things. It's more about the mindset. They're going to be ready to mediate. A lot of what you might do in a private session, if you mix between joint sessions and private sessions, a lot of what you might do in a private session can be done in advance, so it saves you time. You can actually get to the joint session part quickly. The parties develop their thinking better with someone who they feel is on their side than with a mediator who's impartial. They're much more likely to be open if they think that you don't have any control over what happens later on. They're much more likely to be vulnerable, in Brene Brown's words, to talk about their contributions in a way that they feel comfortable and safe exploring that in a little more detail. They're clear about their needs, they're clear about the impact on others, they're ready to communicate, which is often part of the work that we do as mediators, trying to get people to communicate. They're much more future focused because as a conflict coach, I help them unpack all the past stuff before they get there. Well, not all of it, but a fair bit of it. And the agreements reached at mediation are more likely to last. Now, I don't have empirical evidence where I can kind of prove that beyond a doubt, but anecdotally, the coaches that I've trained and who also work as mediators have said when the parties have coaching and they go to mediation, they seem to stick with their agreement. The agreement seems to last better. That's my impression rather than an empirically proven fact. So who should provide it? Ideally, someone who's trained in conflict management and someone who's trained in coaching. And I think that both of those things are required. I don't think you can be an effective conflict management coach if you've just done basic coach training, because I think the awareness of conflict dynamics really helps you ask the right questions at the right time and understand where the areas are going to be that are challenging. And I think having a conflict management background and a mediation background, you can get away with conflict coaching without the coach training, but the coach training helps you take it to a different level when you really understand how to manage that one-on-one relationship, how to create a safe space, how to support a client to think differently in a one-on-one way. It is quite different. And I train a lot of mediators to be coaches, very experienced mediators, and it is a little bit of a different experience. And a lot of them, just like if you're a lawyer who trains as a mediator, you've got to sort of adjust your normal way of doing things. It is different coaching to mediation. It's not just like doing a private session in mediation. It is a different experience for the coach as well as the client. And as I mentioned, ideally you'd have a different coach for each party so that the client felt comfortable that whatever they said to you wasn't, you know, even absolutely intentionally going to sort of seep out to the other person when you were working with them. This is the story bit. So I mentioned the two different types of stories. So this was sort of serendipitous kind of moment where I was doing my PhD. I'd interviewed a whole lot of people about their conflicts, and I didn't really interview them. I said, tell me what happened. Tell me what happened. And I let them tell me a story. The only question I asked when they finished telling me their story, as I kind of nodded and smiled to show that I was still listening, was, did they see a lawyer? And what I was trying to prove was that when people saw lawyers, they adopted this kind of adversarial story, and that lawyers somehow broke people. That was kind of my secret idea of what I was going to find, but it was a chicken and egg thing. It turns out often the people who were already broken were more likely to go to a lawyer. And I use broken, that sounds really derogatory, but the people who were stuck in that dysfunctional way of thinking that it's me against them, I'm the innocent victim, the other person's the bad guy and he should be punished, they were just as likely to see a lawyer as to have been turned into that by the legal system. But what I found as I was also studying a subject about French literature, it was one of those moments that I had these two groups of stories, and the people who were stuck, who were helpless victims, who had this idea of justice that just was not achievable, it fit really well with the genre of melodrama. Now, I'm talking in a very literary sense. How we use the word melodramatic in day-to-day life is a little more simplistic, but basically what it entails is they feel like a victim. They're at the mercy of the other person. They have to demonstrate their innocence, their purity to deserve support. So they spend a whole lot of time trying to establish that they're a good person, that they've not done anything wrong, they haven't contributed to this at all. And they're very unlikely to talk about any actions that they've engaged in. And they certainly don't want to take any actions from now on, because if you act, you might make a mistake and contribute to it and lose your innocence. They have a very simplified version of events, and it often sounds like, and then he did this to me, and then he did this to me, and then he did this to me, and now my life is ruined, and he needs to be punished, and I need to be put back where I started, where I deserve to be, and compensated for all this suffering. And I'll show you this in a visual in a moment, but one of the things about being stuck in that melodramatic story, it's a disincentive for action. We spend a whole lot of time trying to prove our virtue, our innocence. We demonize the other person. We interpret anything they do in a negative way. And our sense of justice is the other person disappears off the face of the earth. That's often the ideal. Or at the very least, they're punished and things go back to the way they were before. So it goes back. There's no moving forward, there's no improving or growth. It's go back to the way they should have been. And if any of you who are personal injury lawyers, you know that kind of fallacy that you get compensated, so it's as if the injury didn't happen. And you never go back there. No matter how much money you get, you never feel like it never happened, because there's still a memory of it. There's probably some scars. There's certainly a whole lot of pain in the legal process. And so even if you get justice, it often doesn't feel like the justice that you thought you were getting. So you're disappointed if you get it, and you're disappointed if you don't get it. So this is kind of what it looks like. Here's my idealized past. I got along great with everyone at work. I was really productive. I was just about to get a new promotion. In fact, I probably was going to be made CEO in the next 5 years. You know, work was awesome. I loved going to work every single day. And then he joined the team. And then he said this to me in this meeting. And then I heard him saying this to the boss. And then I swear he deleted that document off my hard drive, you know, that day that I was out for an hour. And now I didn't get the promotion, or I'm never going to get that promotion. And, you know, my life is ruined, work's a misery. I hate coming to work. And what I want is for him to be taken off out of the organization, and things to go back to the way they should have been. This fantasy return to the past. Here's what reality looks like, right? The past wasn't actually that perfect. Like, maybe it was good, but probably in the past, you know, it wasn't a sure thing they were going to get promoted. It wasn't a sure thing they were going to get to be CEO. There were probably days where they weren't that productive. They probably did make some mistakes on the odd project. There was probably a few team members that they didn't get along with as well as everybody else. There was probably a few moments where, you know, they created some conflict or made some you know, faux pas. And yes, maybe those events where the bad guy did this thing in the meeting and said this thing to the boss, and, you know, maybe they did delete the computer file, who knows? But there were other things that happened around that or in between that might actually be relevant to understanding the conflict in more detail. And there were more people involved, even if not directly. There were people observing it. There were other people at the meeting. Your line manager is observing how you're managing this conflict, and that's staying in their mind. You know, and maybe that's going to impact on what happens in the future. And if we move away from this fantasy outcome, what we actually find is there are actually a whole lot of choices about how to move on from this that might not be that guy leaves and I go back to this fantasy outcome, which is probably not achievable anyway. And even if our choices are limited, even if our choice is, maybe it is a choice between a rock and a hard place, maybe there isn't a whole lot you can do to make this as good as you'd like, at the very least, we learn and we grow from whatever the ashes are, you know. At the very least, we say, well, I know what to look out for next time, or I'm not going to get myself in that mess again. And okay, maybe I have to resign and maybe I have to get another job, but I sure as hell am going to raise those things earlier, and I'm going to be more assertive, and I know what to look for in an interview, and I know the questions I'm going to ask, and I'm going to do my research and find out whether they have any kind of, you know, psycho-narcissistic CEOs there before I take the job. You know, we prepare people to do better next time, even if we can't fix what's happened in the past. Sometimes we can, but the reality is sometimes we can't. And instead of beating your head against a brick wall trying to make it happen, let's see if there are some ways around the brick wall to something that's slightly better. That's better than nothing, right? Better than a really bad headache. So I know I'm going super fast, but I'm really desperate to get this in. I'm nearly finished. These are the shifts. And if you want to know more about this, my book it's on sale for pre-purchase now, which means you pay now, but you don't get it till September. I don't know why people do that. I don't think they're going to run out of copies, but hey, if you want to buy a copy now, go crazy. Routledge is the publisher. And it apparently will actually be sent to people in September. So you can probably wait and pay for it in September if you want one. It talks about these 6 shifts that we want people to make to be ready to manage and perhaps resolve their conflict more effectively. We want their version of events, the story they're telling themselves and others, to move from simple to complex, to recognize that it probably is much more complicated than the story they're telling themselves. There's other stuff going on that is relevant and maybe helpful. We want to move from certainty to uncertainty, and that's not a comfortable place, but if there's one thing that's dangerous in conflict, is being over certain. Is being certain that you are right and that they are wrong, and that you know what is going on and you know what is best. We've all seen it happen in court or in a mediation where some new information comes to light and suddenly it's like, oh wow, that's not at all what I thought was going on here. You want to try and figure that out, or at least figure out the unknowns and the uncertains before you get to that point. We want to help people move from passive to active, not sitting around waiting to be rescued, beating your head against a wall and suffering, when there may be things you can actually do to make things even a little bit better. And then dependency to agency. We don't want you to be dependent on someone else rescuing you, someone else saying it for you. We want you to learn that you have some control over your own destiny, not over everything, but probably more than you give yourself credit for. And we want people to not to stop focusing on suffering. Let's acknowledge suffering, but to use it as the basis of learning, not just as the basis for misery. And we all know those clients who just wallow in their suffering and they don't learn from it. And one of the things that happened in the resilient and growth stories is that, yes, people suffered, but they learned from it. No matter how bad the outcome, they got something positive out of it. And in the book, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I explain it a bit better in the book. The better version, the better genre of conflict story is actually a tragic genre. Now that sounds weird because when we think of tragedy, we think of, you know, like someone makes a terrible mistake, life sucks and then you die kind of thing. But actually there's more to it. Tragedy is a bit more nuanced than that. And tragedy is all about learning through suffering. But in tragedy, the hero has to figure it out for themselves. Tragedy is all about the hero going, what is going on here? How did I get into this mess? I thought this, but then it turns out that. What am I going to do? What are my choices? On the stage in tragedy, the hero often makes the wrong choice and learns the hard way. What I say in coaching is I want to grab people just before they make that fatal mistake and turn it into tragedy with a twist, where we get the benefit of the tragic sensibility, the tragic kind of self-reflection, the tragic embracing uncertainty and suffering for a purpose, and then we twist the ending. So we turn it into maybe a comedy, which is where you have the unexpected upside rather than the unexpected downside. So this is what the book looks like. It's called Conflict Coaching Fundamentals, Working with Conflict Stories. If you go to the Routledge website, or I think it's Routledge, depending on which accent you prefer, you can pre-order it. It's about $60. I think it's Australian, about $60 Australian for a paperback. And for some reason, if you want a hardback, it's like $220. I guess printing, no one orders hardbacks anymore. I believe it will also be available on Amazon as an ebook, a Kindle book and things. But I think they don't release it through Amazon for a couple of months after it's first released because Amazon takes a percentage of the cost. Just really, really quickly, and I'm fast running out of time, the real conflict coaching system, we talk about it very briefly in the book. The book is mostly about the conflict story stuff, but if you want to find out more about the coaching system, you can't read this, it's way too small. If you're interested in finding out more of that, flick me an email, I'll send you the slides so you can actually read them. But also the coaching course is all online, so you can actually do it from anywhere in the world. We've got there's about almost 1,000 people have done it in the last couple of years from all over the world. We have a really cool group of people who meet in different master classes and webinars and things every month. So as well as the training, we've got a really awesome community of people who are engaged in kind of ongoing reflective practice and professional development. And if you're interested in any of that, contact me. I would love to share it with you. Oh, that's it. How'd I do? I hope you're all like thinking, oh, I can watch this in slow motion on the replay so I can actually understand what she was saying.
Oh, you did great. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I especially loved how positive what you're talking about is, you know, the future words you took, you know, open mind, mindset, future oriented, positive empowerment. So that's fantastic. We do have a few questions, and I'll ask one here. Yeah, somebody just asked, can she post her email again? I put it in the chat already, okay? So it's in the chat. And how do you spell Rutledge? Do you know? Or
Routledge.
Okay, thank you so much. There was one question when you and I spoke that you said seems to be people always have. So I'll ask that, and then I'll turn it over to Jeff to take care of the questions from the chat and all, and ask his own. You know, when you're working with one person, you said it's so typical. People want to know, what about the second person, if they are, or more, if there's more than two people involved in the conflict, if they haven't had the training. So could you perhaps tell how, you know, that helps and that really does make a difference?
Yeah. And I think the easiest way to answer that is, this is a very simplistic answer because I want to be quick, but usually in any conflict, it takes two to tango. You know, it's never, almost never, just one person's fault, right? The other person has done something that might contribute to it, or might be contributing to it not being dealt with in an effective way or an earlier way. They may be not standing up for themselves or looking after themselves. But it's amazing how much you can shift the conflict dynamic by changing the way one party to the conflict thinks. If they change their thinking, they might change their whole approach to the other person. I'll give you a really quick example. I had one woman who was convinced that this other woman was bullying her. She was always making comments about her university degrees and, you know, didn't they teach you that at university? And, you know, you've got 2 degrees, surely you know how to do this. And the woman who was the recipient of these comments was very upset about it. As I talked with her in just one session, we unpacked all the things that were going on. We talked a lot about what she knew about this other person. And as we talked, it turned out the other person was the oldest person in the organisation. She was getting close to retirement. She was the only person left in the organisation without a degree. And she was really, really sensitive to it. And it turned out that my client had turned up on her first day of work, literally carrying her 2 degrees in frames to put up in her office, was a little horrified to discover she didn't get an office, she just got a workstation. And probably was like the epitome of everything this other woman was nervous about. And when we talked it through, my client went, oh my gosh, you know, I actually feel really sorry for her. And she has a lot to give and she's really experienced. And, you know, I actually want to learn from her because they don't teach me everything at uni. And her mindset changed like that. And she went back to work and went out of her way to ask this woman for help and to acknowledge her experience. And it disappeared. Like the conflict disappeared. So again, she was telling herself a story about it that wasn't actually the whole story. And when she unpacked a little bit just on her side, the other person was wasn't oblivious to the fact that there was tension, but wasn't involved at all. But my client's change in perception and then slight change in behavior made it all disappear. So that's a kind of an example of how it can work. Not always that beautiful and tidy, but you can make a significant difference.
Well, that's a great story. Thank you. Why don't we turn it over to Jeff then to handle other questions and thoughts?
Thanks, Jean. That was a terrific presentation, Sam. Thank you so much. There are some questions in the chat here. One is, how do you motivate someone to see the benefit? Terry Breer poses, how do you motivate someone to see the benefit of this kind of coaching or this kind of conversation when they seem to enjoy being stuck in their conflict? They're resistant to coaching. There are a lot of people, I have my own 2 cents here, who seem they're comfortable with the victim role because it absolves them of responsibility for making things better. What do you do with those kind of situations?
Absolutely. I guess the easy answer is it won't work for everyone. That the primary requirement for coaching to work is that the client has to be open to changing their thinking and potentially changing their behavior. If you have someone who's benefiting from the status quo or who doesn't have any incentive to change the status quo, then we may well be wasting our time. So there does need to be a bit of a desire for change. Where it's useful is that what they want is a particular change. They're hanging on to this dream justice. And that's what they think they're fighting for. But at least they're willing to try and work for something, or to, you know, they're hoping for something to change about the status quo. If they're too comfortable in the status quo and they can't be motivated to change, then maybe coaching isn't the right outcome, and there are the right process. And there are times where you need someone with power to make a decision for them, or they need an advocate. What I could do with a client like that is to say, what sort of support would be most useful for you? Where are you going to get help? Where are you going to get information? Who's going to stand up for you? You know, if you need someone to save you, who's going to be the person to do that? And how are you going to motivate them? And what information are you going to need to provide them so they can do that properly for you? The other thing though is, often if I just start with really trying to understand where they're coming from, what's their experience been to now, and really unpacking it, often people accidentally realize that they do have some opportunities to do something that might make things better. So rather than telling them there are things that they can do and they should be a little bit more active and maybe they should try some things, we just explore the story and we look in nooks and crannies, and I highlight moments where they have made choices, where they have done something, good or bad. And sometimes that's enough to get people in the mindset of, well, yeah, maybe there is something that I could do, some little thing I could do to make the situation a little bit better for me. And then hopefully we build on that. So yeah, but it isn't suitable in all cases for all people. And their primary consideration is people have to be open to changing at least their thinking as a starting point.
Sam, what if people are represented by lawyers? Do you work in conjunction with lawyers?
I don't usually, but I mean, assuming that the lawyer was comfortable with it, I think that what I could do with a client who was represented was make them better able to give instructions to the lawyer, make them better able to explain to the lawyer all the relevant information that might be of use to the lawyer, to articulate what their needs are, what they'd like to be part of, say, a negotiation or a court case. So I think it's a bit like preparing for mediation. I can prepare the client to be a better client for the lawyer, to come in with better information, better ideas of what they want, maybe some more realistic expectations about what might be possible, which is always useful if you're the lawyer, to have a client with reasonable expectations about what you can and can't do for them. But the other thing, you know, and I think this is an opportunity for lawyers could do this with their clients. Like, lawyers could coach their clients as a first service. And lawyers may actually be able to support clients to then do things themselves. You know, you could provide a do-it-yourself support service rather than I'll do it for you service. So I actually think it's something that lawyers could adopt as one of their services, and maybe one of their sort of entry services, to help triage the clients to, oh, actually this client can do it themselves with a bit of coaching, or this client might need an advocate, or this client might need to file, you know, something in court. So I also think lawyers can adapt this as a service, you know, a supported do-it-yourself process as opposed to a do-it-for-you process.
Got it. We are about out of time. Sam, before I turn it back to Jean and Natalie, let me ask, is there anything we should have asked you but didn't? Are there any other points you just got to get in there?
Oh, look, I think I've bombarded you with enough, but if there are other questions, and I'm sure there are, I'm more than happy to connect with people. You can send me emails. I can record video responses and share them with everybody. I'm pretty accessible. You know, the time difference is always a little bit of a challenge, but I'm really accessible. I'm really passionate about this, and I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about it for as long as you've got to listen. So please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to know more about anything.
Thank you. Your passion, your skill, your expertise all come through loud and clear. We're so happy that you shared everything with us. Thank you so much. So far, our audience has contributed $117,520 to food banks. Let's get going for the Food Bank of Australia or any other food bank to which you feel comfortable contributing. We appreciate it deeply. Thank you, Natalie. Jean, back to you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I love that you included a story about your mom teaching you right from the get-go how to manage these kinds of conflicts. Well
she
done.
told me afterwards she didn't do it intentionally. She just had no clue what I was doing.
Doesn't make any difference. She's genius.
But I think that's a good example too of how sometimes the best coach is someone who has no clue what you're doing.
It's been a delight, and it's wonderful to have gotten to know you. And thank you so very much. All the best to you. And we look forward to more in the future and connecting our new best friend in Perth, Australia, Dr. Samantha Hardy.
Thank you, everybody.
So much.
Yeah, please keep in touch.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.